Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Ozark Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The Hawthorne family name once commanded respect throughout Springfield, Missouri, and the surrounding Ozark region. In 1895, what locals discovered within the walls of their grand Victorian home on Commercial Street would forever alter how the community viewed wealth, power, and the dangers of isolation. The official records speak of a merchant's suicide and a tragic family circumstance. But something doesn't quite fit with the accepted narrative, something that has remained unspoken for decades. According to county records, Thaddeus Hawthorne arrived in Springfield in 1867, shortly after the Civil War had ravaged the region. Like many Northerners who came to the divided border state of Missouri, he presented himself as a businessman seeking opportunity in the recovering South. The post-war economy of the Ozarks was fragile, with former Confederate and Union sympathizers attempting an uneasy coexistence. It was a time when strangers were regarded with suspicion, particularly those with unexplained wealth. Yet Hawthorne seemed to navigate these troubled waters with remarkable ease. Within months of his arrival, he had secured a prime location on Springfield's Commercial Street for his dry goods store. By 1870, he had expanded to include hardware, farming implements, and even banking services for local farmers. Unlike many who struggled during Reconstruction, Hawthorne seemed to prosper almost immediately. His business expanded rapidly from a single storefront to an impressive commercial building that still stands today, though now housing different establishments. The Springfield Republican newspaper for May 1871 described Hawthorne as a gentleman of industry and vision, whose establishment provides all necessities for town and country folk alike. Another article from 1873 referred to him as one of our leading citizens, though somewhat reserved in social matters. That reservation was noted by several contemporaries. Martha Wilkins, the widow of a prominent attorney, wrote in her private correspondence, discovered in 1959, that Mr. Hawthorne maintains a courteous but distinct distance from those who would welcome him into society. He attends necessary functions with appropriate generosity, but slips away before true acquaintance can be formed. By 1880, he had constructed what was then considered one of the finest residences in the area, a three-story Victorian home with a distinctive octagonal turret and wraparound porch. The house stood on a 5-acre property at the edge of town, partially obscured by elm trees. Architectural records indicate that Hawthorne imported materials from as far away as New Orleans and Chicago, an unusual expense at a time when most local buildings used native limestone and timber. What's particularly interesting is how little is known about Hawthorne's origins. Census records from 1870 list him as 35 years old, born in Pennsylvania, with no family history attached. His marriage certificate to Elizabeth Caldwell, dated 1872, offers little additional information, merely stating his occupation as merchant and his residence as Springfield. Elizabeth herself came from a respectable but unremarkable family in nearby Joplin. The Caldwells were moderately successful farmers who had lost 2 sons in the Civil War, one fighting for the Union, one for the Confederacy, a common tragedy in border states. According to church records in Joplin, Elizabeth was active in the Methodist Ladies' Aid Society and taught Sunday school before her marriage. At 22, she was 13 years younger than Thaddeus, which was not unusual for the time, but friends noted her sheltered upbringing and limited experience beyond Jasper County. The Springfield Monitor reported the wedding as a modest affair at the Caldwell farm, with the bride wearing her mother's gown refreshed with new lace from Mr. Hawthorne's store. The paper noted that the couple departed immediately for St. Louis, returning 2 weeks later to take up residence in Hawthorne's rooms above his store while their home was being constructed. The couple had no children for the first several years of marriage, which was noted in local society columns of the time. The Springfield Herald, in its society pages from January 1878, mentions Mrs. Hawthorne's continued the disappointment in domestic matters, a thinly veiled reference to childlessness that was considered appropriate journalistic commentary in that era. Dr. James Morrison's medical ledger, preserved in the Greene County Medical Historical Collection, records 4 visits to the Hawthorne residence between 1873 and 1877 for female complaints. No specific diagnoses are noted, but the prescribed treatments included valerian root, wild yam preparations, and bed rest, standard treatments for what was then termed hysteria or various reproductive issues. By all accounts, the Hawthornes maintained a position of prominence in the community. Thaddeus served on the board of the First National Bank of Springfield and contributed generously to the construction of the new courthouse in 1891. Elizabeth was active in the Ladies' Benevolent Society and hosted regular musical evenings that were documented in local papers. Their public image was impeccable, yet there were whispers. The house staff turned over with unusual frequency. According to employment records at Simmons Domestic Agency, the Hawthorne household hired 19 different housekeepers between 1880 and 1890, with none staying longer than 7 months. This was remarked upon in the agency's internal notes as peculiar for such a prestigious position. Delivery men reported strange rules about when and how they could approach the property. Jacob Thornton, who drove for Keaton Roundtree Dry Goods, mentioned in a 1952 oral history recording that Old Man Hawthorne had these rules. You couldn't come up the drive unless the blue flag was on the gatepost. You had to ring the bell exactly 3 times, no more, no less. And you couldn't look at Mrs. Hawthorne direct if she happened to be in the receiving room. Most peculiar thing, made all the delivery boys nervous. And there was the matter of the high stone wall that Hawthorne commissioned in 1882, surrounding the entire property, unusual for the area and time, when most prominent families preferred to display their homes as symbols of their success. The construction of this wall caused considerable comment in Springfield. The contractor, Silas Putnam, later recalled that Hawthorne specified the wall be 8 feet high, with a foundation extending 3 feet below ground. He said he wanted privacy, Putnam noted, but it seemed to me like he was building a fort. In 1883, the Hawthornes suddenly announced the adoption of 2 young adults into their household, Maxwell and Josephine, supposedly the orphaned children of Thaddeus's cousin from Philadelphia. Both appeared to be in their late teens or early 20s. No adoption records have ever been located, and inquiries to Philadelphia authorities in 1953 revealed no death certificates for parents matching the description Hawthorne provided to his associates. A rare photograph from 1884, discovered in the archives of the Springfield Historical Society, shows the 4 Hawthornes posed formally on their front porch. Thaddeus stands rigid in a dark suit, his hand resting on Elizabeth's shoulder as she sits in a chair beside him. Behind them stand Maxwell and Josephine, both dressed in somber clothing. What strikes viewers of this image is the remarkable similarity in the facial features of Thaddeus and Maxwell. The same heavy brow and square jaw. Josephine, while more delicate in appearance, has the same deep-set eyes. Elizabeth, by contrast, looks almost like a stranger in the grouping, her pale features and light eyes markedly different from the dark intensity of the others. The following years showed a pattern of increasing isolation. The musical evenings ceased. Elizabeth withdrew from the Benevolent Society, citing poor health. Thaddeus maintained his business operations, but delegated more responsibilities to his managers. The family was occasionally seen in church, always together, always leaving promptly after the service without participating in the customary social hour. Reverend Thomas Winters of First Presbyterian Church made a notation in his parish journal in December 1887. Visited the Hawthorne residence today to inquire after Mrs. H.'s health, as she has been absent from services. Was met at the gate by Mr. H., who assured me all was well, but declined to admit me to the house. Observed curtains moving in upper windows, but saw no one. Have concerns about the household that I cannot quite articulate. By 1890, The Hawthornes had effectively removed themselves from Springfield society, though Thaddeus's businesses continued to thrive. Local gossip suggested that Elizabeth had developed a nervous condition, though the nature of this ailment was never specified in any medical records that have survived. The business ledgers from Hawthorne Mercantile show substantial profits throughout this period, with particular success in land transactions and private lending. Thaddeus appeared to have a talent for identifying struggling farmers who needed immediate cash, offering loans at rates that were described by a former clerk as not usurious, but certainly firm. By 1893, Hawthorne owned mortgages on more than 30 properties throughout Greene County and had expanded his interests to include a grain elevator and a small railway spur connecting to the main St. Louis line. What happened on April 17, 1895, was recorded in the Springfield Herald as a terrible tragedy and a shocking affair. According to the official account, Thaddeus Hawthorne was found dead in his study, having apparently taken his own life with a shotgun. The article noted that Mrs. Hawthorne and the two adopted children were in a state of extreme distress, and that no explanation for the merchant's desperate act has been forthcoming, but this is where our story truly begins, for what was printed in the newspaper barely scratches the surface of what actually occurred within the walls of the Hawthorne home. The truth, pieced together from courthouse records, personal journals, and testimonies that remained sealed until 1963, reveals a far more disturbing reality. The initial investigation was conducted by Sheriff James Holbrook, whose handwritten notes were discovered in a county storage facility during renovations in 1957. These notes, which never made it into the official report, describe the scene in far more detail than was shared with the public. Hawthorne's body was indeed found in his study, but the configuration of the room was unusual. The furniture had been arranged in a circle, with chairs for 4 people. A legal document lay on a small table in the center. Hawthorne's chair had toppled backward, and there were signs of a struggle. Most significantly, the shotgun that had ended his life was found several feet away from the body in a position that made suicide highly improbable. The walls of the study were lined with books on unusual subjects. Sheriff Holbrook noted titles related to bloodlines, hereditary traits, and family dynasties. One volume, open on Hawthorne's desk, contained handwritten notes in the margins referencing purity of line and removing contaminants. Elizabeth, Maxwell, and Josephine were discovered in the parlor, seated together on a sofa, unmoving and unresponsive to initial questions. Sheriff Holbrook noted that they seemed neither surprised nor particularly distressed, but rather resigned, as though awaiting an expected outcome. They offered no resistance when asked to accompany the deputies to town for questioning. Deputy William Clark, who remained at the house to secure the scene, later reported finding a partially burned document in the fireplace. The legible portions described a purification ritual to be conducted in the sanctum. Clark's report was filed but subsequently removed from official records. His brief mention of it in personal correspondence only came to light when his granddaughter discovered his letters in 1962. The document found in the study was a contract, drawn up in Hawthorne's own hand. It detailed what he called a family covenant, establishing rules by which all 4 members of the household would abide. The language was formal, almost biblical, but the content was disturbing. It specified that no member of the family could leave the property without Hawthorne's express permission. It required daily attestations of loyalty from each person. Most strangely, it established a system of restitution for any perceived infractions against family harmony. The covenant stated, "As head of this household and keeper of its bloodline, I, Thaddeus Hawthorne, do establish these ordinances for the preservation of our family legacy. All who dwell under this roof are bound by sacred obligation to maintain the purity of our line, to submit to correction when necessary, and to place family loyalty above all earthly concerns." During questioning, Elizabeth Hawthorne said little, repeating only that Thaddeus had his reasons and that the covenant must be honored. Maxwell and Josephine were similarly reticent, though a deputy noted that Josephine had visible bruising on her wrists and neck, which she attributed to a fall in the garden. Maxwell, when pressed about his relationship with his adopted father, stated only he believed in his purpose with absolute conviction. We learned not to question. When asked directly if he had shot Thaddeus, Maxwell looked at Elizabeth, who gave an imperceptible nod, but before he could speak, the family's attorney arrived and ended the interview. The attorney, Gregory Simmons, was a junior partner at a St. Louis law firm who arrived with remarkable speed, suggesting he had been summoned before the authorities were notified of Hawthorne's death. Simmons presented documents showing that all of Hawthorne's business interests had been transferred to a trust controlled by Elizabeth just 2 days earlier. On April 15, 1895, he also produced a will, allegedly signed by Hawthorne on the same date, that left everything to his devoted wife and adopted children. No charges were filed. The coroner, Dr. Samuel Wilson, ruled the death a suicide, despite the physical evidence suggesting otherwise. Dr. Wilson was a prominent member of the same Masonic lodge as Hawthorne and had received financial assistance from him to establish his medical practice years earlier. The investigation was officially closed within 3 days. The Hawthorne widow and adopted children returned to the house on Commercial Street. For several months they maintained the same isolated existence, with groceries and other necessities delivered to the gate in the stone wall. Then, in October 1895, they left Springfield altogether. Property records show that the house was sold to a banker from St. Louis who never actually occupied it. The Hawthorne dry goods business was liquidated, with the proceeds apparently transferred to a bank in Chicago. For decades, that was where the story seemed to end. The house changed hands several times before being divided into apartments in the 1920s. The Hawthorne name faded from local memory, becoming just another footnote in Springfield's history. In 1952, however, renovation work on one of the apartments uncovered a hidden space between the second and third floors. Inside was a trunk containing personal papers, photographs, and 3 leather-bound journals. The property owner at the time, Harold Winters, donated these items to the Greene County Historical Society, where they remained largely unexamined, until a graduate student from the University of Missouri began researching forgotten Ozark merchant families in 1963. The journals belonged to Elizabeth Hawthorne and covered the period from 1872, just after her marriage, to October 1895, just before the family's disappearance from Springfield. The early entries describe a young woman's adjustment to married life and her husband's increasing business success. Elizabeth writes of her hopes for children and her disappointment as the years pass without conception. March 15, 1873. T. has presented me with a beautiful silver hand mirror for our first anniversary. When I admired it, he said, "A Hawthorne bride should always look her best." He speaks often of children, of carrying on the family name. I pray nightly that God will bless us with a child soon, as I see how much this means to my husband. November 10th, 1873. Dr. Morrison visited again today. He says there is nothing apparently wrong, that these things take time. T. was in the room throughout the examination, watching with such intensity that I felt more embarrassed than the procedure itself warranted. Afterward, he locked himself in his study for hours. By 1877, the tone changes. Elizabeth describes Thaddeus as increasingly controlling, dictating her daily schedule and monitoring her correspondence. She mentions his dark moods that can last for days, during which he locks himself in his study with his account books. She writes of her fear when these moods descend and of learning to anticipate his needs to avoid triggering his displeasure. July 7, 1877. T. destroyed the letter from my sister today, saying her descriptions of her children were unnecessarily provocative, given our situation. When I wept, he said I was being manipulated by others' happiness, and that a true wife would focus on her husband's needs rather than what she lacks. I try to be a true wife, but sometimes the silence of this house seems to press upon my very soul. August 18, 1877. T. has begun speaking of his family history at great length. He traces his lineage to early settlers in Pennsylvania and speaks of a special destiny. When I mentioned that my grandmother was partly of French descent, he became very cold and said the Hawthornes had maintained their English bloodline without contamination for 200 years. I will not mention my French ancestors again. In an entry dated March 3, 1880, Elizabeth writes, T returned from his Philadelphia trip greatly altered. He speaks of new business opportunities, but will share no details. He has instructed me to prepare 2 rooms on the 3rd floor, but will not say for what purpose or for whom. When I inquired, he looked at me with such coldness that I dared not ask again. The entries for most of 1882 and early 1883 are missing, torn from the journal. When the record resumes in April 1883, Elizabeth writes simply, "They have arrived. God help us all." From this point forward, Elizabeth's writing becomes more cryptic. She refers to Maxwell and Josephine not by name, but as the cousins. She documents a household operating under strict rules, with specific times for meals, conversation, and what she calls contemplation hours. She describes Thaddeus reading aloud each evening from a black book that is not identified, but is clearly not the Bible or any recognized literary work. May 30th, 1883. T has explained to me privately what I had already begun to suspect from the resemblance. The cousins are in fact his own blood, born to a woman he knew before me. The mother has died, he says, and it is his duty to bring them into the proper family fold. He speaks of his bloodline with such reverence that I dare not question further. I am to treat them as family, but remember always that I am not of their blood. September 12, 1883. J attempted to visit the milliner's shop in town today without permission. T discovered her absence immediately, as though he can sense when any of us steps beyond the boundaries he has set. When she returned, he took her to his study. The cousins and I sat in the parlor, silent, listening to his voice rising and falling behind the closed door. Later, at dinner, J would not raise her eyes from her plate, and there was a small cut at the corner of her mouth. The most disturbing entries begin in 1889. Elizabeth writes of the basement chamber and the correction chair. She mentions sounds in the night and how she has learned to block her ears with cotton wool soaked in laudanum. Several entries simply read, "He took her to the chamber today." I played the piano as instructed, but the music was not loud enough. February 3rd, 1889. T has completed what he calls the sanctum in the basement. It has thick walls that he says are for privacy during instruction, but I think they are to muffle sound. There is a chair with straps, a table with instruments I do not recognize, and a bookstand holding the black volume. He has shown it to all of us, explaining that family discipline must sometimes be formalized to be effective. M asked if I would also be subject to the chair's correction. T smiled and said, "Elizabeth is not of our blood. Her transgressions require different management." July 19th, 1889. M was in the sanctum for hours today. When he emerged for dinner, he moved like an old man. T watched him struggling to sit upright at the table and nodded with satisfaction. "The bloodline is strengthened through trial," he announced. "Our ancestors understood this principle." Later, I helped Emmy apply witch hazel to the welts on his back. He whispered, "It isn't about correction. It's about submission." I fear he is right. By 1894, Elizabeth's handwriting has changed, becoming more erratic. She writes less about her own experiences and more about watching Thaddeus with Maxwell and Josephine. She describes them as hollow-eyed and notes that Josephine's hair has turned prematurely gray. One particularly chilling entry reads, "Jay tried to leave yesterday. T found her at the wall. He smiled at dinner and announced there would be a special ceremony tonight." M wept silently. I pretended not to notice. November 4th, 1894. T now requires that Mama and Jay refer to him as father, though they are grown and he is not truly their father in the eyes of the law or church. The resemblance between the three of them has grown more pronounced, as though they are being molded into copies of him. Or perhaps it is that they have all come to wear the same expression, watchful, wary, with something burning beneath the surface. I catch M looking at T sometimes with such concentrated hatred that I fear for what might come. December 25, 1894. Christmas passed without acknowledgement. T says Christian holidays are meaningless rituals that distract from family obligations. Instead, he held what he called a blood ceremony in the parlor, pricking each of their fingers and pressing them to a page in the black book. I was not invited to participate, but was required to witness. M asked why I was excluded, and T struck him across the face, saying, "She is vessel, not essence." I do not know what he meant, but the words chilled me. The final journal entry, dated April 16, 1895, the day before Hawthorne's death, is perhaps the most revealing. He has drafted a new covenant. We are to sign it tomorrow. M says he cannot bear it any longer. I have given him the key to the gun cabinet. What will be, will be. I am beyond caring now. These journals raised far more questions than they answered. Who were Maxwell and Josephine really? What was the nature of the covenant that Hawthorne imposed on his household? What happened in the basement chamber? In 1964, with the journals now part of the historical record, a reporter for the Springfield Chronicle began investigating the Hawthorne case. Thomas Jennings traced property records and discovered that the house's basement had been concrete sealed during renovations in 1905 at the specific request of the then owner, despite no structural necessity for such work. Jennings interviewed Calvin Morris, the contractor who performed the sealing. Morris, then in his 80s, recalled, "That basement had a peculiar feel to it. There was a room with walls a foot thick, no windows, just a heavy door with a complicated lock. Inside, the floor had these dark stains that wouldn't come up no matter how we scrubbed. The new owner took one look and said to seal the whole thing up, pour concrete over the entire basement floor. Said he'd pay extra if we didn't discuss what we saw down there." Jennings also located burial records for a Maxwell Hawthorne in a small cemetery outside Chicago, dated November 1895. The cause of death was listed as respiratory failure. The attending physician's notes, preserved in county health records, mentioned evidence of long-term physical trauma and a constitution weakened by repeated stress. No records for Elizabeth or Josephine were found, though Jennings discovered a passenger manifest for a steamship departing New York for Liverpool in December 1895 that listed an E. Hawthorne and J. Hawthorne among the passengers. Through extensive research in British archives, Jennings traced a land purchase in Cornwall, England in February 1896 by an E. Hawthorne, widow. The property was a small farm near the coast, far from major population centers. Local church records show a Josephine Hawthorne marrying William Bennett, a local farmer, in 1903. The marriage certificate lists her age as 38 and her status as spinster. The most significant discovery came when Jennings tracked down Albert Peterson, the son of the Hawthorne's gardener. Peterson, by then in his 70s, recalled his father speaking of the strange goings-on at the Hawthorne property. According to Peterson, his father had once accidentally encountered Thaddeus, leading Maxwell to the basement at gunpoint. He was dismissed the following day, but told his family what he had seen. "My father said Mr. Hawthorne was different when he thought no one was watching," Peterson told Jennings. "In public he was all proper and dignified. But on the grounds, when he thought only family could see, he moved like a predator, always watching, always controlling. Father said Mrs. Hawthorne would sometimes stand at an upstairs window for hours, just staring out like she was trying to remember what freedom looked like." Peterson also remembered his father mentioning that Thaddeus Hawthorne had a peculiar obsession with what he called family purity. Hawthorne allegedly spoke of bloodlines and inheritance with unusual frequency and intensity. Peterson's father believed that Maxwell and Josephine were not adopted cousins at all, but Hawthorne's biological children from a relationship predating his marriage to Elizabeth, brought to live with him after their mother died. This theory gained credibility when Jennings discovered a deed of sale for a small property in rural Pennsylvania, signed by Thaddeus Hawthorne in 1873. The witness signatures included one M. Blackwood, the same name that appeared on early shipments to Hawthorne's store in Springfield. No further record of Monsieur Blackwood exists after 1873. Jennings's investigation unearthed a newspaper notice from the Philadelphia Inquirer, dated January 1873. reporting the death of Margaret Blackwood, 35, survived by 2 children. The brief obituary mentioned that the children had been sent to relatives, with no further details. Census records from 1870 for Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, list a Margaret Blackwood, age 32, with 2 children, Maxwell, age 9, and Josephine, age 5. No husband is listed, and Margaret's occupation is given as seamstress. This would make Maxwell and Josephine approximately 22 and 18 when they arrived at the Hawthorne home in Springfield, the ages reported by observers at the time. In 1965, with permission from county authorities, a structural engineer and a local historian inspected the sealed basement of the Hawthorne house, by then converted to a restaurant. What they found was largely unremarkable, a typical basement of the era, with storage areas and a coal chute. However, one section of wall showed evidence of having been rebuilt, with bricks of a slightly different color and texture. Behind this wall, they discovered a small room with unusual features. The floor was made of stone, rather than the packed earth or wood common to the period. The walls were lined with cork, a material used for soundproofing in the late 19th century. Iron fixtures were embedded in the floor, and one wall, though whatever they had once secured, was long gone. Most disturbing was a drain in the center of the floor that had been carefully sealed with concrete. Due to the historical significance of the building and concerns about structural integrity, no further investigation was permitted. The basement was resealed, and the restaurant continued operations until it closed in 1968. The building still stands on Commercial Street, now housing offices and a small art gallery. The true nature of what occurred in the Hawthorne household remains uncertain. The physical evidence suggests that Thaddeus was indeed murdered, most likely by Maxwell, with at least the tacit approval of Elizabeth. The journals point to years of psychological and possibly physical abuse, controlled by a man whose mental stability deteriorated over time. What became of Elizabeth and Josephine after they left America? Did they find some measure of peace in a new life abroad? Or did they carry the scars of their years in that house with them forever? In 1967, a woman named Eleanor Bennett contacted the Springfield Historical Society, claiming to be the granddaughter of Josephine Hawthorne. She provided photographs and letters suggesting that Josephine had settled in Cornwall, England, married a local farmer, and lived until 1943. Bennett declined further interviews, however, stating that her grandmother had never spoken of her life before England, and had made family members promise never to inquire about it. One letter, dated 1939, from Josephine to her daughter, Bennett's mother, contained a cryptic warning: "Never allow any man to isolate you from the world." Walls can be built of stone, or they can be built of fear and obligation. Both are equally effective prisons. The fate of Elizabeth remains more mysterious. The property in Cornwall was registered solely in her name until 1920, when ownership transferred to Josephine Bennett. Local records show Elizabeth listed as residing in the household through 1915, after which there is no further mention of her. There is no death certificate, no burial record, no will or probate filing. It is as though she simply faded away. Perhaps the most telling piece of evidence regarding the Hawthorne case is not what was found, but what was deliberately concealed. In 1895, Sheriff Holbrook submitted an official report that omitted most of his actual findings. Dr. Wilson certified a suicide despite evidence to the contrary. The banker who purchased the property never lived in it but paid for its maintenance for nearly a decade before selling it at a significant loss. It suggests a collective decision by the business leaders of Springfield, by the authorities, perhaps even by the community at large, to bury a truth too uncomfortable to acknowledge. That a respected merchant, a pillar of society, could create a private world of control and fear behind the walls of his impressive home was simply too threatening to the social order they wished to maintain. The Springfield Monitor, in a brief article from May 1895, reported that Mr. Thaddeus Hawthorne, having suffered a tragic accident, was laid to rest yesterday in a private ceremony. The business community mourns the loss of a leading citizen. There was no mention of the circumstances of his death, no reference to investigation or inquest. The newspaper's owner, William Bryant, served on the board of First National Bank alongside Hawthorne and had received substantial loans from him to expand his printing operation. The legacy of the Hawthorne case extends beyond the fate of one family. It speaks to the power of wealth to shield wrongdoing, to the vulnerability of those who live in isolation, and to the human capacity to normalize the unthinkable when it happens gradually, one small compromise at a time. For Elizabeth, Maxwell, and Josephine, the stone wall that surrounded their property was both a physical barrier and a metaphor, separating them from help, from community, from escape. In her journal, Elizabeth wrote of watching from an upper window as people passed by on the street beyond the wall, going about their normal lives, unaware of what was happening just yards away. That wall still stands, though the iron gate has long since been replaced. Visitors to the building today pass through it without a second thought, unaware of its original purpose or the lives it once contained. The stones, quarried from the Ozark hills, have weathered to a soft gray. They reveal nothing of what they have witnessed. The Hawthorne case also reveals how much of history remains hidden, how many stories go untold or are actively suppressed. For nearly 70 years, the true events in that house remained obscured by social convention, by deliberate concealment, by the simple human desire to believe that such things could not happen in a civilized community. It raises questions about other hidden histories, other silenced voices. How many more Elizabeth Hawthornes have there been watching the world from behind walls they cannot breach? How many Maxwell and Josephine Hawthornes, bound by blood to their tormentors, trapped in a perversion of family loyalty? In 1966, construction workers renovating the attic of the former Hawthorne house discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside was a small wooden box containing a child's shoe, several locks of dark hair tied with ribbon, and a folded piece of paper. The paper, when carefully unfolded by archivists, revealed a crude drawing of 4 stick figures standing beside what appeared to be a house. 3 of the figures were drawn in black ink, while the 4th, slightly apart from the others, was in blue. On the reverse was written in a childish hand, "Family is forever." The box and its contents were donated to the Springfield Historical Society, where they remain in storage, a footnote to the larger mystery of the Hawthorne family. Attempts to date the items or identify who might have hidden them have been inconclusive. In the end, what happened to the Hawthorne family remains officially unresolved. No charges were ever filed in Thaddeus's death. No investigation was ever conducted into the hints of abuse and imprisonment suggested by Elizabeth's journals. The case was never officially closed because, in the most technical sense, it was never officially opened. And yet, the echoes remain. Employees in the building report unusual cold spots in certain areas. Tenants have requested transfers from specific offices without providing clear reasons. During the restaurant years, staff frequently quit after working late closing shifts, citing a persistent feeling of being watched. One waitress who worked at the restaurant from 1964 to 1966 told Jennings, "The building just felt wrong after dark, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I'd be closing up, and I'd hear footsteps on the floor above, even though I knew I was alone in the building. Or I'd catch a reflection in the window of someone standing behind me. But when I turned, there was nobody there." The worst was the basement door. Sometimes it would be open in the morning, even though I'd locked it the night before. I never went down there alone. These reports could be dismissed as the natural human tendency to project the known history of a place onto its present. But they might also be something else, the lingering resonance of extreme emotion imprinted on physical space. Not ghosts in the supernatural sense, but the psychological residue of real human suffering. The Hawthorne case reminds us that the most disturbing horrors are not those of supernatural monsters or inhuman creatures, but the quiet hidden cruelties that humans inflict upon one another, especially those they claim to love. It reminds us that wealth and respectability can serve as effective masks for darkness, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who have earned our trust. In 1968, shortly before his death, Albert Peterson made one final statement about the Hawthorne case. "My father told me once," he said, "that on still nights, when the wind wasn't blowing, you could sometimes hear sounds coming from that house. Not screams or anything like that. Just voices talking very quietly, like people who know they're being listened to." He said it was the saddest sound he'd ever heard. People talking without saying anything real, because they couldn't. That house wasn't a home. It was a performance that never ended. The Journals of Elizabeth Hawthorne, held now in the special collections of the University of Missouri, continue to draw researchers interested in the psychology of isolation and control. Dr. Marion Winters, who studied the documents extensively in the 1980s, noted what's remarkable is the transformation of Elizabeth's voice over time. The early entries show a conventional young woman with normal hopes and fears. By the final years, her writing has become almost dissociative, detached, fragmentary, as though she's reporting on events happening to someone else. It's consistent with what we now recognize as a trauma response. Dr. Winters also highlighted the significance of Elizabeth's role in Maxwell's final act of rebellion. By giving Maxwell the key to the gun cabinet, she made a choice. After years of passive observation, she took action. Was it justice she sought? Release or simple revenge? The journals don't tell us. But that single act transformed her from witness to accomplice. The Springfield Historical Society maintains a small exhibition about prominent local merchants of the 19th century. The Hawthorne display is modest: a photograph of the house, a ledger from the store, and a silver letter opener that belonged to Thaddeus. There is no mention of the events of 1895, no reference to the journals or the hidden room. The accompanying text describes Hawthorne simply as a successful businessman who contributed to the growth of Commercial Street. This sanitized version of history persists in official channels, but the true story continues to circulate in less formal ways. Tour guides leading ghost walks through historic Springfield include the Hawthorne house on their route, though they often embellish the facts with more dramatic supernatural elements. Local high school students dare each other to stand by the stone wall at midnight. Amateur historians occasionally attempt to access the sealed basement, despite the current owner's prohibition. In 1995, a century after Thaddeus Hawthorne's death, the Springfield Chronicle published a feature article revisiting the case. The journalist Rebecca Stevens had tracked down Marion Bennett, Eleanor Bennett's daughter, and Josephine's great-granddaughter, who still lived in Cornwall. Marion shared family photographs and a few additional letters, but most significantly, a small diary that had belonged to Josephine. The diary, covering just 3 months in 1895, offers a rare glimpse into the mind of one of the adopted cousins. Josephine's entries are sparse and careful, as though written by someone who feared discovery, but they provide crucial context to Elizabeth's account. On March 30th, 1895, Josephine wrote, "Father spoke today of the need for the bloodline to continue. He looked at Maxwell and me in that way again. M became ill at dinner and had to leave the table. Father said weakness must be purged from the line. On April 10th, Father has decided. The new covenant will formalize what he has been suggesting for months. M says we will die before submitting to this. I am not so certain I have the courage to die, but I cannot live as Father intends. E watches us with pity, but does nothing. She is as trapped as we are, though in a different cage. And finally, on April 16th, the day before Thaddeus's death, tomorrow we sign. Or we end this, M is resolved. I waver between terror and hope. E has made her choice at last. Whatever happens, nothing can be worse than what we have endured these 12 years. If there is a God who sees into this house, let him judge us with mercy." The diary ends there. Like Elizabeth's journal, it raises as many questions as it answers. What exactly did Thaddeus Hawthorne intend to formalize in the new covenant? The scattered evidence points to a disturbing possibility, that he was planning to create a closed family line, with Maxwell and Josephine, his biological children, producing the next generation of pure Hawthornes. Such arrangements were not unheard of among certain isolated religious sects and in some aristocratic families obsessed with bloodlines, though they remained deeply taboo in mainstream society. The discovery of books on heredity and family purity in Thaddeus's study supports this interpretation, as does Josephine's horrified reference to what he has been suggesting for months. If this was indeed Hawthorne's intention, it casts the events of April 17, 1895, in an even more tragic light. Maxwell's act becomes not just rebellion against years of abuse, but desperate resistance to a future too terrible to contemplate. Marion Bennett, speaking to the Chronicle in 1995, said her great-grandmother Josephine never discussed the Hawthorne name or her early life. She would only say that she had been rescued from a terrible fate and that she had left that life behind in America. My grandfather, her son, said she had nightmares all her life and couldn't bear to be in small, windowless rooms. She kept the doors open, even in winter. According to Bennett, Josephine found some measure of peace in her marriage to William Bennett, a kind, uncomplicated farmer who asked few questions about her past. She named her daughter Elizabeth, Marion noted, which I always thought was significant, given what we now know. As for the real Elizabeth Hawthorne, her fate after arriving in England remains a mystery. Local church records in Cornwall show no burial, no remarriage. The property deed transferred to Josephine in 1920 suggests Elizabeth lived at least that long, but in what state or condition is unknown. Marion Bennett offered one tantalizing clue, a photograph taken around 1910 showing Josephine with her young children outside their farmhouse. In the background, slightly out of focus, a woman sits in a chair by the door. Her face is not clearly visible, but she appears to be watching the children with a kind of wistful attention. My mother said that was Aunt Elizabeth, Marion told the Chronicle. She wasn't really an aunt, of course, but that's what the children called her. According to family stories, she rarely spoke and never left the property. The local people thought she was simple or had suffered some brain fever. She tended the garden and was particularly fond of the children, though she seemed afraid to get too close to them. Was this silent, withdrawn woman the same Elizabeth who had once hosted musical evenings in Springfield and taught Sunday school in Joplin? Had the years in the Hawthorne house so profoundly damaged her that she retreated into near muteness? Or had she always been, as Thaddeus cruelly suggested, merely a vessel, a means to provide his biological children with social legitimacy while he pursued his twisted vision of family legacy? As we conclude this account, consider the walls that surround us in our own lives, not just physical walls, but the barriers of silence, of social convention, of fear. Consider what might be happening behind the impressive facades of the buildings we pass every day, behind the carefully maintained public images of the people we think we know. The Hawthorne house stands as a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying truth is not what we can see, but what remains deliberately hidden, sealed away like a basement chamber, buried like a family secret, walled off like a private kingdom where one person's word is absolute law. And perhaps that is why the story continues to disturb us more than a century later. Not because it is extraordinary, but because in certain fundamental ways it is all too familiar. The Hawthorne case may be extreme, but the dynamics it reveals of power, control, isolation, and silence play out in countless homes, in countless ways, even now. The sound that still echoes after all this time is not the shotgun blast that ended Thaddeus Hawthorne's life. It is the quiet that preceded it, years of enforced silence, of stifled cries, of words that could not be spoken. And in that silence lies the true horror of what happened behind the stone wall on Commercial Street in the spring of 1895. In the archives of the Springfield Historical Society, among the materials relating to the Hawthorne case, there is a small envelope containing a single sheet of paper. It appears to be a page torn from a larger document, possibly Elizabeth's journal, though it matches none of the known volumes. The handwriting is hers, but the ink is different, darker, more definitive. There is no date, but the content suggests it was written after leaving America. I have asked myself 1,000 times if I could have done more sooner, if I could have protected them better, found help, broken through the walls he built around us all. But fear is a prison more secure than any stone or steel. By the time I found the courage to act, so much damage had been done. Maxwell lies in the earth now, his brief freedom purchased at terrible cost. Josephine carries scars visible only to those who know where to look. And I am neither here nor there. I exist in the space between what happened and what might have been. I have no right to peace, but I pray they find it. The Hawthorne name dies with us, as it should. May whatever darkness dwelled in his blood die with it as well. The document was never officially catalogued. It sits in its envelope, a final whisper from a woman who spent most of her life being silenced. The curator who discovered it in 1972 considered adding it to the collection, but ultimately decided against it. Some stories, he reasoned, have earned their rest. The commercial street building that was once the Hawthorne home was renovated again in 2002. During construction, workers discovered a small tin box hidden within a wall cavity. Inside was a daguerreotype of a woman holding 2 small children. The photograph was wrapped in a child's handkerchief embroidered with the initials JB, possibly Josephine Blackwood. The items were donated to the Historical Society but have never been displayed publicly. Today, those who walk past the old Hawthorne property might notice the unusual height of the stone wall, the distinctive turret visible above it, the solid presence of a house built to impress and to conceal. Few know the full story of what transpired there. Fewer still understand the relevance of that story to our present day. How wealth and power continue to shield abusers, how isolation remains a tool of control, how communities still look away from uncomfortable truths. The most insidious horror is not the monster that leaps from shadows, but the slow erosion of self that happens behind closed doors, one concession at a time, until submission becomes survival and resistance seems impossible. The most terrifying villain is not the stranger, but the trusted authority who uses love as a weapon and loyalty as a chain. As night falls over Springfield and the old buildings on Commercial Street cast their long shadows, consider this: the walls that contain the Hawthorne family's suffering still stand. The floor that covered the sanctum still bears the weight of those who walk above it, unaware. The ground where Maxwell Hawthorne is buried, wherever that may be, still holds his bones. The past is never truly gone. It sleeps beneath our feet, behind our walls, in our collective blind spots, and sometimes on still nights when the wind doesn't blow. If we listen closely enough, we might hear what Albert Peterson's father heard, the soft, careful voices of people who know they're being listened to. People who cannot speak freely, people performing a script written by someone else. That is the sound of a horror that has no need of supernatural elements. It is entirely, terribly human,